Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. Today we're going to look at some of my recent reads from the last few weeks. As usual, I'm going to start from my lowest rated and then up to my highest rated. Let's start from Dinner Party, A Tragedy, which is a debut novel by Sarah Gilmartin. This follows the life of Kate, who's a woman in her 30s, and she lives in Dublin. And the initial setup for the story is this dinner party that she's having with her siblings. And from there, the story progresses with a timeline jumping around a little bit, and we get to find out a lot more about her younger years and her relationship with her family, with her parents in particular, and so on. This has a lot of themes that I think will resonate with a lot of people, in particular when it comes to loss and family loss and trauma in your childhood and your younger years, and that kind of messy relationships that I think a lot of families would have, and then onto the challenges of growing up and putting up with the pressures that society put on yourself, eating disorders, that sort of thing. So there's definitely a lot going on for this, and I can see how Gilmartin definitely has a lot of potential, I think, in her writing. Although I have to say that overall it felt somewhat short of its potential for me. I was perhaps hoping for something a bit more gritty, a bit more punchy. So I was slightly let down, I have to say, even though it's definitely not a bad book by any means. I also wanted to say this seems to be slightly mismarketed because the cover says it's a dark and twisty. It's somewhat dark, but not overly dark. But it's definitely not twisty, I wouldn't say. So I would imagine a lot of people would pick this up expecting some sort of thriller or something like that. And I think it was a bit unfair. I wouldn't hold it against the book. It doesn't have to be twisty, but I don't think it was. So I'm not sure why they would suggest it was. So I ended up rating this 7 out of 10. Moving on to Know My Name, which is the memoir by Chanel Miller. And in this book, she recounts her experience being a victim of sexual assault, and in particular, her ordeal having to navigate the justice system as well, and how taxing and frustrating it can be for victims to essentially to having to put their whole lives on hold to get some form of justice. And this is definitely very touching, very harrowing, and I think a lot of people will find it quite emotional and quite tough to get through as well, especially if it's something that resonates with you personally. I'm not American myself, so I wasn't particularly familiar with the story and with the background, but I know in the States this was a very high-profile trial and a very high-profile case that a lot of people were already familiar with. I have to say that the writing for me was very strong for the first 30 to 40, almost half of the book, sort of 5-star territory, because it's really, really effective and really well written as well. I have to say that the second half for me started to become a bit repetitive, and it wasn't as tight as I think the first half of the book was. So I was slightly disappointed from that perspective. I know that a lot of people do the audiobook, and perhaps that might help, but I was slightly disappointed overall, even though it's definitely a book that has a very important message to tell, and I wouldn't, take that away for a second. So I ended up rating this 7 out of 10 as well. Then I read Kindred, which was another slight disappointment given all the 5-star reviews that I had previously seen for this book. In case you're not familiar with this is a science fiction meets historical fiction sort of story, where we have this Black woman from the 70s, because this is a 40-year-old book, give or take, who's in a mixed race relationship. She has a white husband, and she gets somehow transported into the past to save this white child in the pre-Civil War United States, but in a southern state, crucially, where slavery was still commonplace. So we get to see this contrast between her modern sensibility versus the abhorrent society of where slavery was still practiced at the time. There's definitely a lot of really impactful themes that get explored in the story, and it was very emotional to see the contrast between these two aspects. And I think she depicted a lot of this with a certain degree of nuance as well, and also having a main character that is not necessarily the most likable necessarily, which I think was a pretty clever choice. However, that said, there were quite a few things that I wasn't fully on board with. The writing, I didn't necessarily find that fully worked for me. There was a fair amount of telling and of dialogue that was restating things that were pretty obvious. Also, the dialogue overall was a bit clunky for me. And the time travel element, again, felt slightly gimmicky. So I still enjoyed it overall, but I wasn't blown away as I was perhaps hoping or expecting to, given how so many people really, really love this book. I still want to read more by Butler because I think I've heard different takes on different books from different people. So I think I still want to give some of her books a go in future, but this one I rated 7 out of 10. And then more Irish fiction for me this month, because I read my first Sally Rooney novel, Normal People. And in case you're one of the very few people who have not heard of this book before, this follows the two main characters who grew up in the west of Ireland, and we follow their lives in their teens and the 20s, and Rooney explores their friendship/relationship. There's this constant, won't they get together? They're sort of friends with benefits, but then they grow apart and they have other relationships, but then they get back together, and so on. I quite enjoyed Rooney's writing, I have to say. There's a lot of things that she manages to explore with a lot of nuance when it comes to our insecurities or our traumas that we carry from our past, from our family relationships, from the struggles that we had growing up, being integrated in our circle of friends, and so on. While I don't necessarily get the hype around Rooney's writing, it was definitely a book that I enjoyed and was very well written, and I will still recommend. I have a full review if you're interested. I ended up rating this 8 out of 10. And then coming up to some of my favorites for this month, the first one is another memoir, and it's A Dutiful Boy, which also won the Polari Prize, which is an LGBTQ prize that takes place every year in London. And here the author recounts his life growing up in London from a very conservative Muslim family. And pretty early on, he realizes he's a bit different and he's actually attracted to men. But homosexuality is not really an option that is available to him, given that the environment that he's in. So he ends up in this really dark, really lonely place, because walking away from his family is not really an option available to him either, because of how deep his attachment to his family was. So he describes his struggle not really being able to fit into any of these communities, but it's actually a really hopeful book in the end, because obviously he's now able to write about it being in a much better place than where it was. I have a full review for this as well. If it sounds like the type of story you might be interested in, I would definitely strongly recommend it, and I rated this 9 out of 10. And lastly, I have Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, which is translated from the Japanese. And this follows the life of Natsuki, who's this young girl who's having a really tough time with her family and the environment around her. And we get to see her life and the traumas that she experiences. And eventually she convinces herself, together with her cousin, that they're not actually inhabitants of planet Earth, but they're aliens that landed to Earth somehow. So we get to see this sort of outsider's perspective onto society. And after a time jump, we also get to see how their lives evolved into their adult years. This is a really tough read. There's a lot of really, really dark scenes that a lot of people will find really challenging to read, and really sort of twisted ones as well that are really out there. The author is not really sparing any punches. She's really pushing things out of the ordinary where she can. That said, there were a lot of really impactful themes that I really enjoyed the exploration of. Things like coping with trauma and putting up with the expectations that society puts onto people, women in particular, but people more generally as well. And also just having to conform into mainstream society versus the issue of extreme withdrawal from society as well. So I really enjoyed, if enjoy is the right word here, this read. It was something that really stayed with me, and I think will stay with me further for a while. So if you're into that sort of really dark books, it's another one that I would really recommend. And I have a full review for this one as well if you're interested, and I ended up rating this 9 out of 10 as well. I hope you guys liked this video. Please give me a thumbs up. If you want to discuss any of these books with our community or anything else, join our Discord. The link is in the description box, and I'll see you the next time.